Today, on this episode of the Going Deeper podcast, we are super thrilled to have Dr. Sandy Richter in the studio with us, as well as Jennifer McDonald, sitting in because Sandy has been with us this weekend at Trinity and teaching us and leading us and preaching for us. And we're going to have a great conversation about what does it take to write a Bible study and where do you get the inspiration to write Bible studies. I'm your host, Kyle McCaskill.
I'm Jennifer McDonald.
And I'm Sandy Richter.
So join us as we go deeper. So welcome to Trinity, and it has been so much fun getting to know you in person. I feel like a lot of us here feel like we know you because we've done so many of your Bible studies, and our time here, your time here has been just totally delightful.
I'm glad to hear that.
I want to thank you for taking time out of your Sunday after church, after lunch, to sit in the studio and just chat with us a little bit.
I'm so grateful to be here. So thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely.
And I have had a lovely time at Trinity.
Well, good.
So, yeah.
We try to be hospitable and polite and everything.
You're knocking it out of the park, actually.
Yeah. Oh, well, good.
Between fabulous meals and gifts in my hotel room and my own personal king cake. Come on. It doesn't get much better than this.
It's really hard to beat the king cake, isn't it?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was really interested in, because I talked to you briefly about the origins of this podcast that we do and how me and Marie and Becky would sit around and just kind of hash out questions with Scripture and wrestling with this commentary versus that commentary. And so we started recording the conversations, and that's how the podcast started. And so I guess one of my big questions for you, somebody who has written multiple Bible studies, you teach Old Testament curriculum or have taught it for however many years.
Yes.
Then what's your process? Is there a process, or are there certain things that you always do or certain things that you never do?
That's a great question. The process is evolving, and the more I do this, the more there becomes an actual process. So when we started with understanding the Old Testament, which is the overview of Epic of Eden, the situation was that I had already written the book, The Epic of Eden, and I had been using that material in adult education in a bajillion different settings. So in using that material, over the years, it had evolved into a weekend intensive. And the weekend intensive was really great for that material because the whole gig is taking a group of people from Eden to the New Jerusalem and showing them how the story actually goes together from the Eden to the New Jerusalem, and using the covenantal framework and organizing their closets and all of those catchwords that now belong to me, right?
Right.
So I had been doing that all over the country, and there'd been too many weekends away, and it was very effective, and always I would just have this stellar response from whatever church or conference or camp was involved, because people want to understand their Bibles and they want to put their Bibles together. So that evolved into a late night conversation with J.D. Walt, who is the director of Seedbed Media Resources. And he was just launching Seedbed, and we were friends and worked together at Asbury. And I was bemoaning the fact that I had a day job. I had 2 babies at home. I had a husband who liked to see me periodically. I needed to sleep sometimes. There was this publication schedule. And I could literally be gone every weekend doing this overview. And that was when kind of both Seedbed and the video curriculums was born. JD said to me, well, why don't we film it? And I was like, film it? Who wants to watch an Old Testament professor? He's like, oh, girl, you have no idea what lies ahead. So that whole process of doing the first one was all of us just figuring it out.
Yeah.
I had the curriculum, and it was very well tried, tested and tried. I'd used it many, many times. I knew it worked. I knew it didn't work. I could break it into different time segments, all because I'd had to do it for churches and conferences and camps and youth programs and you name it. So that part was done. But figuring out what a study guide looked like, figuring out what to put in a study guide, figuring out how to film it, how to break it into film, how to make it accessible and easily utilized by an adult discipleship program. Oh my gosh, that was that was trial and error. That part.
But the end product of that original Epic of Eden study, you would never know that y'all were just shooting from the hip, I guess. I mean, or just trying stuff out to see what would work, because it turned out so good.
I'm so glad to hear that. We did wind up actually completely rewriting the study guide. We thought we could hire out, and for a lot of reasons. One was my own schedule, and in other Bible studies, people do. They'll hire someone else to write the study guide. Well, that didn't work, and I wasn't at all satisfied with the product. And honestly, I'd love to redo that study guide, and maybe I'll do that in the next 10 years. But in that process, we developed a format and the headings that have now become so familiar to our students, the first contact or, diving deeper, all that sort of thing. That was when it was established. So at that point, it was a matter of, there was a backlog of material that I'd been doing with churches and retreats and lay settings that could be transformed into film studies. So Jonah and Ruth and Isaiah, in many ways, were ready to go. There were a lot of shifts at Seedbed that made some of those things more challenging. One of the things we decided along the way was having 5 studies, per week was too much, that very few groups could actually do 5 studies. So then we dialed it back to 3, and then we started getting feedback that it wasn't enough. So with the Psalms curriculum, I think we have 3 required and a bonus study every week. So you can do 4, but you don't have to feel guilty about doing 4.
I would be the one that didn't feel guilty about not doing the bonus.
Okay, good. So, and that rhythm seems to have worked very well. And with each study, we've learned and refined. And so for myself at this point, I still have a backlog. I could do Amos and Micah tomorrow if I needed to.
I would love to see Micah.
Would you?
Oh, yeah. That's got one of my favorite verses in it. You probably know which one.
And Micah 6:8,
That's
I'm going to
the
guess.
one.
Yes. It is a very popular one.
And there's not a lot of studies or preaching, even Sunday school lessons done about the prophets, especially the minor prophets. Of course, you hear about Jeremiah and some Isaiah, mainly. I'm just speaking from experience growing up, but Isaiah, the only thing I knew about Isaiah was his prediction of Jesus's birth. But that's basically it. So I have very little knowledge about the minor prophets, especially.
That's good feedback for me to hear, because I forget these things, and I'm thinking in terms of really, does anyone need another Bible study on Micah and Amos? Because, of course, they're considered the social justice prophets, and we are, that is our cultural moment. But yeah, so all that to say, I do still have backlog.
Okay. That's good news for us.
One of the arenas where I wind up with my very first run of any sort of curriculum is going to be Redwood Christian Park, which is this family camp that we've been associated with for 20 years. And we've gotten to the place, despite my many protests, where they want me and only me as their Bible teacher.
Oh, wow.
Which means I have to come up with a new curriculum every summer.
Oh, wow.
And
so where is that located?
it is in the mountains of Santa Cruz, California.
Oh, wow. I bet it's beautiful up there.
It is beautiful.
Is this the one that you mentioned in your Psalm study?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And it launched its life as a Methodist camp meeting. For those who aren't on the West Coast, the Methodist Church is not doing terribly well on the West Coast. And so our beloved family camp is having to network itself into the newest Wesleyan revival, basically. Okay. So as so many ministries these days, they're in some ways recreating themselves. But apparently I'm a permanent fixture. So that's where a lot of this stuff is birthed. And then it gets refined. So as Trinity has been experiencing, this Deborah Judge's curriculum is one that I'm playing with right now. Right. And having to create it, loving to create it for a live audience of folk who have done a bunch of the epic studies, thank God for Trinity UMC. So I brought my curriculum here. We've had all these wonderful, passionate Christ followers who invested, and I'm going home with a file folder full of suggestions and, hey, tweak this, hey, emphasize that, and that's really helpful to me.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad that we have people that were comfortable enough to offer good constructive criticism and suggestions.
That and some really funny titles.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which we're going to have to work on those too.
Yeah. So Pearson is one of my best friends, probably my best friend in Ruston.
Okay.
And of course, married to Jennifer.
Yes.
So he is very good at that.
I think I have 12 from him, 12 potential titles.
He went easy on you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Oh, yes.
So I think that's going to be very fun. And so, honestly, when I did the Ruth curriculum, I did something similar. I had a very well-established curriculum that I'd done a number of times, but I took that curriculum to a neighborhood Bible study, and my neighborhood was a mixed bag of Christians, non-Christians, and hell no Christians. And having those people sitting in my living room studying the book of Ruth, I gained so much insight into writing a curriculum for seekers, and was reminded of, hey, these people don't know the Bible has a table of contents.
Yeah.
They have no idea that Ruth has got her own book. They have no idea that Hezekiah doesn't have his own book.
Right.
So they wrote a bunch of questions for me too, and helped me to remember what it felt like not to know. So that's built into the Ruth curriculum.
That the Ruth study was so good because you've got the whole story of Ruth and Boaz, which our friend Becky, that's like a very pivotal story for her.
Okay.
Just because, and I remember when we were in Kentucky with her, and she came over to our house after going to your class and hearing about the Kinsman Redeemer. And like she was weeping of how beautiful it was. And so because of your impact on her and then her turnaround impact on us, like that's kind of also become something that in our family, we love that. My daughter, who is 9, loves that whole story. She's been reading through that. She read Ruth, and I think just recently she read Esther with my wife. But So having these examples and having this material that helps it come alive for us is so beneficial as for me as a parent, because now I can help my kids dig deeper.
And there's nothing better than that. Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful to hear that those materials are having that impact. When it's, for me, all of these various studies have a story behind them, where I was and what I was doing when I was prepping them, and the various junctures where I was teaching them or engaging churches or students or missions organizations. And so every time these studies come up, every time I revisit them, there's a host of the faithful who are standing behind the studies. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but I dedicate every study to the people that I learned this with. And that is very, very true. That's
I must have missed that.
It's in the dedication page. Who reads that?
Yeah.
But I do, because that's how this feels. And what I've organized around the Deborah curriculum that I'm working on is I have 4 or 5 speaking engagements in the next 6 months, 8 months, where I'll do this curriculum again, and which means I'll figure out what connects, what doesn't connect. I'll figure out what, hey, you're interested in that, and you're the only one, so maybe that should go. And watching and experiencing an audience respond to a study, for me, that's how I figure out, okay, that's where the Holy Spirit is. That's where the message is.
Yeah.
That's what people have to take home from this, which, of course, that's the magic, right?
Right.
Is where this story actually meets us. Yeah.
And I think that's probably the difference that the different sense that I get from a lot of these studies is it's very apparent, your heart, for not just the material, but for the message. And I remember being blown away at the end of every Epic of Eden study, and how you would always bring it back to the New Testament tie-in. It's like, there's just beauty in that. And we forget that so many times.
My first introduction to you was when we joined Becky's small group, and she had just started your Jonah study. We were doing that, and this was like right before the pandemic. And I remember my opinion of Jonah changing, because in the past I had thought of him as, like, I thought he was just a big coward. Like, he was just kind of a sellout, just like maybe some laziness, like, nah, I don't want to do that. But like, you helped put it into perspective. I don't remember if I kind of drew these parallels myself, or if you actually mentioned them, but just like, imagine yourself going to New York City or Los Angeles and telling everybody there, hey, if you don't change, if you don't repent, God is going to destroy you. And that made me feel so terrified, because that is the last thing I would want to do. So it's like, I don't blame Jonah. I would have done the exact same thing. Jonah gained a lot of sympathy from me.
No, that's interesting that it would be the big city part of it that captures you. For me, it was getting to know the Assyrians.
Yeah.
And not only getting to know the Assyrians, but realizing that as a citizen of the Northern Kingdom, Jonah had watched the fallout of their violence over and over again. That this wasn't, like, for example, I'm afraid of ISIS, but I've never had any personal encounters with ISIS.
Right.
Jonah was afraid of the Assyrians, and he'd had personal encounters with the Assyrians. Big surprise, he gets on a boat and tries to disappear. And would I have done any different?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, because God was calling him to go to their mothership.
Yeah. And when we talk about the communities of faith and the stories that are linked to these curriculums for me. For me, the first time I ever taught on Jonah was at the Missions Society annual event.
Really?
Yeah, many years ago. And I was no one, and they did not yet know my name. I was not part of the tribe. And they'd heard a rec from someone, and they pulled me in to do this little gig on Jonah. And I'm standing in front of this crowd full of missionaries. And I'm the honored one who gets to recite the words. And I'm telling the story of Jonah. And one of the things I did with these missionaries is I put the map of Nineveh and Jonah's mission up, and how he was terrified, and he hated these people, and he had good reason to hate these people. And then I overlaid the modern map, so Nineveh is Mosul, and we had just come out of one of our more recent Persian Gulf type of crises, and I was standing in front of people who had literally put their lives on the line to bring the message to the people on this planet that I was most afraid of, and in many ways hated the most. And standing in front of, who knows, 600 missionaries, I completely lost it.
Oh, wow.
Like the kind of losing it where there's nothing Hollywood about this moment. This is snot and sob, and you can't get your voice back over the profundity of what he did, even though he didn't want to.
Yeah.
And even though he didn't do it elegantly, but he did it. And so when I think about the Jonah curriculum, that's one of the memories that comes flooding back to me. And now when I think about the Deborah curriculum, it will be Trinity United Methodist Church in Ruston, Louisiana.
And a king cake.
And king cake and frog legs.
Yeah.
So,
All right, so one of the phrases that you use a ton that I just absolutely love is, and you may have to correct me on it, but it's real people, real places.
real faith.
Real faith.
Yeah. Okay.
That whole notion, because I think being so detached from that culture in modern America, it is very easy for us to just view a lot of that stuff as story, narrative, and not necessarily historical. But then being reminded that these were real people. And then another one of my favorite words that if you go back and listen to any of our old podcast episodes, you'll hear me use the word ethnocentric more than once.
Yes, it's a good word. Yes.
And to really put that into perspective of we can't judge ourselves as better than them because we know more than they did then.
We're so advanced.
Yeah. And so just being able to have that frame of reference to me makes, again, so much difference in how you approach Scripture, how you, not just the books that you've taught on, but all of it.
Yes.
And being able to now kind of decipher with the tools that you've given us through your studies to go read the book of Joshua and say, okay, well, wait a second. Let's talk about this, or any of the other books in the Old Testament. You can even do it in the New Testament.
Yes.
So, of course, that's you're not as that's not your
forte.
Your forte, right?
Yeah, I do read the New Testament.
Oh, I'm sure you do. It's very clear that you do.
Sometimes, but not as much. But you've tagged, I think, two critical messages, not just out of Epic of Eden, but honestly out of my teaching career. The real people, real places, real faith. Let me dial this back. I'm teaching at Westmont College now. Although we require our faculty and our staff to sign faith statements to teach at our little Christian liberal arts college, we don't require our students to. So I will always have a mixed bag of students sitting in front of me at this point, which is great. Yeah. But what I will say to them on a regular basis is those of you who come from really dedicated church backgrounds, homeschooled, memorized the books of the Bible when you were 3, all that sort of thing. And then those of you who come to me basically as unwilling pagans who are required to take a GE course in Old Testament, you both have the same problem. Mm-hmm. And, they'll look at me like, how can we have the same problem? And the problem is this. For both the kid with the flannel graph and the kid with no exposure to the Bible, none of these people are real.
Yeah.
They're either living in their ivory towers and they've never actually struggled, or they literally aren't real. They're just fictitious characters that someone made up along the way.
Yeah.
So one of my jobs, and I think one of the funnest part of my jobs, is to rehabilitate these characters and to put flesh on them and personalities on them and watch my students' faces when they're like, oh, that was really hard. Mm-hmm. Oh, he was really scared. Oh, that must have broken her heart. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, real people. Because for both of those groups, once they step into the space where these are real people, empathy starts rolling. Mm-hmm. And when that empathy starts rolling, and they start connecting to their people, which is another big part of my theme, then the examples of faith that are offered to us in the text become powerful. And before those people are real, the messages of faith aren't powerful. And probably tagging into your other favorite word, ethnocentrism.
I just like big words.
I know, it's a cool word.
It is.
You're an etymology guy.
Yeah, you
That's
are.
Right. Uh-huh.
Etymology guy.
Uh-huh.
I would say that feeds into the same issue. Mm-hmm. Because, as I'll say in the book and in the videos, although there's something beautiful about the fact that we put our own faces on the biblical characters, when we strip them of their own faces because of our ethnocentrism, when we strip them of their culture, of their value system, their worldview, and the way they do things, then once again, we've stripped them of being real people.
Yeah.
And we are not only missing the story, we are not engaging the actual characters of this great narrative. And who would want to read Harry Potter and know nothing about him?
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Thank you.
And my son loves Harry Potter. Well, y'all love Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I haven't read them. I've watched the movies.
You have a 9-year-old, right? Is what you said?
Well, I have a 9-year-old and I have a 12-year-old son.
Oh, so they're in the zone.
Yeah, he has consumed all of the Harry Potter. And when I use that word consume strongly,
right.
Because that's what he did with it.
And he's waiting for his letter from Hogwarts, I'm going to guess.
Probably.
Yeah, and you missed his 11th birthday unless you sent it for him.
Oh, bummer. See?
I know.
Parenting fail, right?
Still waiting
Right
on
there,
that owl.
major fail.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, do you have any other questions, any other tidbits?
I guess I've got a couple, just like 2. Hopefully they won't be too long. So how did you get started in Old Testament studies and specifically Deuteronomy? Like did you just wake up from a nap one day and decide,
I'm going to do Deuteronomy stuff?
yes, do Deuteronomy stuff and Old Testament stuff? Like how did you settle into that?
Yeah, and it can be a long story or a short story. I'll try to make it the shorter end. It's certainly been a journey. I did not wake up one morning saying I was going to do Deuteronomy stuff or that I was even going to do Old Testament. I started off by getting saved and having my life transformed and having good people discipling me, and wound up very aware that I had some sort of call to ministry. What does that mean, and how am I going to follow it? And as a good Catholic kid raised in a Jewish neighborhood, what does it even mean to have a call to ministry? So I went to a little Christian college and I trained for ministry, and I went into youth pastoring, and then I became an associate, and I did all of these different things that were kind of like a cattle chute running me toward this ultimate goal. And honestly, it was a denomination that didn't want me would be the final catalyst. because I was credentialed, I was in ministry, and they just were not keen on women or education. Both of those things made them very uncomfortable, and those were kind of my identity and my gifting. So I wound up with some encouragement exploring being in the classroom. And when I started exploring being in the classroom, that required me to explore graduate school. And I was very much of the posture that Jesus is coming back next week. Why do I want to waste my childbearing years and $100,000 going to get a PhD? You know, that's just crazy. And as God kept narrowing the chute, it became apparent that if I was going to teach, that was exactly what I was going to have to do. And I had no confidence that I was going to be able to do it. The barriers, the hurdles were impossible. And one after one, God just kept pulling the barriers out of the way. And the next thing I know, I was enrolled in the Hebrew Bible major of the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department at Harvard University. You gotta be kidding. And so that's where the Old Testament stuff came from. It really was, you know, honestly, I'm seeing in my mind either a really good little sheepdog or a God with a really big stick, just kind of whacking me left, whacking me right until I walked through the right door. And the Deuteronomy stuff, it's almost an equally ridiculous story. I had to do a seminar when I was starting my PhD. They call it the 200 seminar at Harvard.
Okay.
And that's what they call it, but we call it the hazing ritual. So
really enjoyable experience.
Oh, so traumatic. So your job is to write a paper that's supposed to be publishable. The entire department and a squad of faculty join. Somebody critiques your paper, and they rip you apart for 2 hours. It's wonderful, really good for your self-esteem.
That's making me sweat right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was assigned a particular topic that had to do with the nature of the presence of God in the temple in Old Testament religion. That was the topic. As I began to explore it, I crashed into something called the name theology. We won't even go there. It's all bound up in Deuteronomy. I wrote the paper. I got beaten up for 2 hours. But I had moved into new territory. And although that made a lot of people angry, it also captured a lot of people's attention.
Oh, I bet.
And so that new territory eventually became my dissertation. And from that point onward, I was Deuteronomy girl. Yes.
All the Deuteronomy stuff.
I know. I do the Deuteronomy stuff. So
that's fantastic.
I'm kind of thinking about, you know, I am Deuteronomy girl, you are Pentateuch man. One day I will be Pentateuch man as well.
Somebody needs to write a comic strip of that. There's a Christian comic strip artist. Maybe we need to enlist him to write
academic jokes.
Yeah.
There'll be, 75 of us who laughed really hard. So,
Pearson draws cartoons.
Oh, he does. That's right.
Okay.
Oh, we need to task him with making a character, Deuteronomy girl.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think we're about at our time limit now.
Okay, good.
So I want to thank you for taking the time
Absolutely.
to chat with us. This has been just a fantastic conversation. And I'm going to turn to the camera and I'm going to tell those people who are listening and or watching that you need to go ahead and give us a like, give us 5 stars. This is probably the most 5-star podcast that we've ever done. So definitely give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
Do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And subscribe if you haven't already and all that stuff. And I guess with that, if we have no other comments, I'll say thanks for listening and we will see y'all next time.